This is the top deck of the century, the kind of thing legends are made of. Your hands are shaking with anticipation as your eyes dart around the table. The Tacoma player is almost ready to go for it with an infinite mana combo, and the Rakdos player has their commander online, and they've just been waiting for a card draw source to reload their hands. And the Arumi player has been stocking their graveyard with creatures to reanimate threefold. You tap out and cast your Haymaker spell, catapulting yourself ahead of everyone else. The Rakdos and Tacoma players both groan, cursing your lucky top deck, but the Arumi player holds up a hand and says, "Wait, I have a response." Your heart falls into your stomach as they tap 2 islands and hold up a counterspell. Don't count your chickens until they resolve, they warn you. Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we're going to discuss the state of blue counterspells. Last year we did an episode all about the state of green ramp, so I think it's about time we talked about another color's signature type of spell. Now, with over 300 cards which fall into this category, this could potentially be a monster of an episode. There's a good chance I may divide this into multiple episodes. And, bear with me as I get things started, because before I can even delve into the counterspells themselves, I think it's important to actually try to define what a counterspell is. And if you're enjoying these episodes, please consider giving us a like, leaving us a comment, or subscribing on YouTube, or giving us a like on your podcasting app of choice. It really helps us out. Let's start with the basics, trying to actually define what a counterspell is. Fundamentally, counterspells are a check which a player can use to determine whether or not a spell which is on the stack resolves or not. Most spells have an effect only when they resolve, which I guess seems sort of obvious, but there are some spells which have an effect on cast as well, most famously the Eldrazi Titans, who have triggers which go onto the stack as soon as the spell is cast. This means that even if you counter the spell, that triggered ability will still resolve. Back in the day, Counterspell was printed as a card type called Interrupt, cards faster than instants, which couldn't be responded to except by another Interrupt. While that card type has thankfully been removed from the game with all of its odd rules complexity, the concept of a counterspell being a blue player's opportunity to interrupt the casting of a spell and to have a say in whether or not it resolved remains at the core of how all counterspells work. This means that even cards which don't say counter target spell on them are potentially used as counterspells, particularly when they are throwing an opponent off of their plan by sending a card that they were counting on to resolve back to their hand or into exile or into their library. I am saying this because we will be discussing a few cards which wouldn't show up on a basic Scryfall search of counter target spell. I also have to acknowledge that counterspells have a bit of a stigma associated with them, particularly among newer Magic players. Part of it has to do with the nature of blue including tricky forms of interaction like mill, bounce spells, and of course counterspells. Players coming over from other TCGs or CCGs like Hearthstone don't deal with counterspells due to the limitations baked into the rules of those games, which are meant to accommodate quick, snappy, turn-based gameplay between two players through a virtual client, and counterspells really do interrupt the flow of that gameplay. To newer players, a spell being stopped by a counterspell feels like they never got to even play with their card. When I'm teaching new players, I try to liken it to the black mage casting a spell like Doomblade or a white mage casting Swords to Plowshares. Answers allow the game to be interactive, and this prevents the player who draws the biggest threat from just running away with the game. The blue mage has their most definitive answers while a spell is on the stack, and otherwise they have very few options for card types like artifacts and enchantments, which have already resolved. My goal for this episode is to help you choose which counterspells are right for your deck, so I will be giving these spells a very rough ranking up in the left corner of the screen. But I do also hope to highlight when a particular card may be a really good match for a very specific game plan, and in that case, the card's synergy may bump it up a few ranks in your own card evaluation for your deck. And as with most things, if you're looking to optimize your deck, you usually want to err on the side of cheaper counterspells, so that you can both advance your game plan, such as by playing mana rocks or engine pieces like Rhystic Study, while also being able to counter a spell. But free counterspells aren't really right for every kind of game. The more casual the game, using casual in Sage of Fable's definition on their deck building alignment chart, the less you really need free counterspells. You're going to eventually have a lot more mana to play with anyway. And the more battlecruisery games are going to be fought more on the battlefield than they are on the stack. So in a battlecruiser metagame, for example, where the biggest threats that opponents will often play will be creatures, it may actually be correct to replace a negate with a remove soul, as countering creature spells could be more important for you and for your metagame than countering non-creature spells. I won't always assume that this is the case, and I will try my best to highlight the most general use cases for a blind metagame whenever I can. Just as with the State of Green ramp, we're going to start out at the lowest cost to counter a spell and work our way up to higher cost spells. The old standard cost of a counterspell was 2 mana value. It was, well, counterspell. And in modern design, you're looking closer to 3 mana value for cancel. The standard counterspell tends to be heavy in blue cost, requiring at least 2 blue mana in addition to any generic mana costs. Standard counterspells are also hard counters. They counter the spell and do not include any quote-unquote unless clause. These are more soft counterspells, usually giving the owner of the spell an additional cost for them to be able to prevent their spell from being countered. Standard counterspells are also unconditional. Cancel and counterspell aren't limited in the types of spells they can counter. Standard counterspells also don't compensate your opponents with anything for them losing their spell on the stack, and standard counterspells are no frills affairs. You don't get any additional upside from countering the spell. Card draw, +1/+1 counters, scrying, tap downs, bounces, or anything else are upsides that some counterspells have in order to justify their higher cost. We've also talked about offensive versus defensive counterspells before, but very briefly to review, defensive counterspells are meant to stop opponents from landing a threat or advancing their game plan in a meaningful way, while offensive counterspells are used to force through a threat of your own or to protect one of your threats or your overall game plan, using a counterspell to stop opponents from countering you. The last point to mention is that counterspells in Commander are used much differently than counterspells in other formats. There really is no good way to build a solid draw-go style control deck, where your goal is to 1-for-1 your opponents early and then overwhelm them late with more powerful threats. Because if you 1-for-1 3 different opponents during your turn cycle, you're going to be down 3 cards and your opponents are only going to be down 1 card each. Being stuck in the role of table police and trying to counter or control everything is almost always a losing proposition in Commander. Instead of trying to 1-for-1 all of your opponents to death, counterspells are best used judiciously, with the goal of stopping key plays by your opponents. It's almost always correct to try to counter someone's win condition while it's on the stack, but it's usually wrong to try to counter someone's ramp spell. Obviously, there is no hard and fast rule for this, but if you generally want to reserve your counterspells, you want to do so for a defensive use, stopping your opponent from putting you on the clock, whether through an actual game-winning threat or from an engine, which will quickly overwhelm you with advantage, or offensively, stopping opponents from answering your game plan, particularly when you are trying to put them on the clock. We're going to start our discussion with free counterspells, as there are a number of counterspells which can be cast without spending mana, most of which have some significant setup cost or an additional hidden cost in order to actually cast the spell. They may also have some conditions on what sort of spells they can counter. Force of Will is likely the most universally playable version, as it is an unconditional hard counter. Though decks which are extremely light on blue may have difficulty keeping a blue card in hand in order to exile to Force of Will, and it can be very painful when you have to pitch another counterspell to Force of Will, only for an opponent to have had that counterspell of their own. The 1 in life cost isn't nothing, but it isn't likely to be a major cost in Commander. Force of Will is also nice because it can be used either offensively or defensively. You can use it to back up your own threat that you're trying to force through, or stop opponents' threats when you're otherwise tapped out. Next up in terms of raw power is likely Fierce Guardianship. In spite of being a conditional counterspell, Fierce Guardianship can stop all non-creature spells, which means it can hit most of the big haymakers an opponent is going to be trying to cast, while also being free to cast if your commander is out. This is another free counterspell that is easy to use either offensively or defensively. It also doesn't force you to suffer card disadvantage the way a Force of Will does, so it may work even better in decks that are lighter on blue, and it's easier to cast when the setup costs can be met. but just having the non-creature spell condition definitely makes it worse than Force of Will. Fierce Guardianship is great when you're on a game plan for your deck where you can expect to cast your commander early in the game, particularly when the commander's mana value is less than the critical turn of your metagame. The idea being that if you can reasonably expect to land your commander before people are going for it, then you can reasonably expect to be able to cast Fierce Guardianship for free. In CEDH, 2 mana value commanders make Fierce Guardianship really, really good, for instance. Next up, Pact of Negation, and this one actually has a mana value of 0, not just a cost reduction like others. It's also an unconditional hard counter, but it does have a rather significant setup cost, though it is one that you can play around. Just as with Force of Will, Pact of Negation can be used either offensively or defensively, but Pact of Negation works a little better on offense than it does on defense. When used defensively, Pact is pretty good since it lets you develop while holding up interaction for free, and it doesn't have any card disadvantage baked into it. When used offensively though, Pact can be amazing, as you can often avoid paying the 3 blue altogether if you win the game after casting Pact of Negation. Backing up a Thoracle Consult with Pact of Negation has been a solid way to end many games in CEDH. This is probably also a good time to talk about Spite Pacting, or casting Pact of Negation defensively when there's no reasonable way for you to pay for it. The etiquette for this varies from pod to pod, but in CEDH it's generally felt to be in poor taste, as the Rule Zero conversation implicit in CEDH is that everyone is playing to win, and if you cast a Pact of Negation without the ability to pay for it, you've essentially conceded the game in order to stop somebody else from winning. If you have the possibility of being able to pay for it, such as having a Dark Ritual in hand that you could use to get the 3 blue to pay off the spell, or just some kind of a plan to get that Dark Ritual into hand, or even just the possibility of drawing it with one of your draw engines. It's a risky play, but you could argue that you were playing to your outs of either I lose on your turn, or I have a chance to not lose on my turn. The other situation where this is more of a gray area is when you suspect that the person trying to win has protection, and you're trying to bait that protection out with a Pact of Negation to allow another player to counter the threat in response. In this case, you're casting Pact of Negation and not expecting it to resolve. This is more a form of good cooperation between players than it is a spite pact. Outside of CDH, I'd argue that it is likely even greater breach of etiquette to spite pact, as implicit in that game action is the statement that you would rather not play the game at all than let somebody resolve a particular spell. Moving on from Pact of Negation, we get into the more debatable free counterspells, where their relative value of inclusion depends more on the composition of your deck. Force of Negation is an almost purely defensive counterspell, where you can pitch another blue card in order to counter a non-creature spell. So this is a very heavily conditional hard counter. It only works against non-creature spells like Fierce Guardianship, and it can only be cast for free on another player's turn. And it has the card disadvantage like Force of Will baked into it. The card shines best when you have the ability to win at instant speed, or you can play a really effective game on other players' turns, which allows you to use Force of Negation offensively as well. In CDH, Force of Negation is often used to back up an ad nauseum, particularly in decks that are looking to play at instant speed. But it's often cut in the decks that are more planning to play on their own turns versus opponents' turns. Mental Misstep deserves special mention because of the Phyrexian mana. This card can be played for 2 life instead of a single blue, and it does see play in CDH. It is an extremely conditional counterspell, only hitting 1 mana value cards. CDH is a metagame where there are many impactful 1 mana value cards, including a lot of interaction like other counterspells, and lots of broken mana rocks. Decks that are going deep on interaction can reasonably expect to cast it whenever they draw it, but it likely would not see play without being free. For instance, Spell Snare is a 1 mana value counterspell which can only target 2 mana value spells, and it sees almost no play in CDH in spite of 2 mana value spells generally being much more impactful. Cards like Underworld Breach, Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, and countless problematic stacks pieces weigh in at 2 mana value. Mindbreak Trap is starting to see more play in CDH as another free counterspell, and it's one heck of a potent counter with one heck of a setup cost. One specific opponent must have cast at least 3 spells from Mindbreak Trap to be free, so in CDH it's seeing play more and more as players are looking for ways to stop Ad Nauseam and Underworld Breach lines. Specifically lines involving Brain Freeze, since Mindbreak Trap can exile all of the copies of a spell from the stack as well as preventing players from getting another bite at the apple. It's a powerful option to fight Storm decks, with fringe benefits being that it can get around can't be countered clauses on cards like Destiny Spinner and Veil of Summer. But the upfront cost of 2 blue can make it a difficult pill for some decks to swallow. Misdirection deserves mention here as well, since its cost is very comparable in a lot of ways to Force of Will, though it is effectively a much more limited counterspell without actually saying counter on it anywhere. You can use Misdirection as a counterspell by targeting another counterspell. If Misdirection resolves, you change the target of the counterspell to Misdirection, which means the counterspell has to be able to target a blue instant with a mana value of 5. Misdirection then leaves the stack, and the counterspell on the stack fizzles because it no longer has a target. This does get around the can't be countered clause, but Misdirection is essentially Force of Will, which can only be used to counter other counterspells. And like Force of Will, it's a pretty strong source of card disadvantage. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this episode, but being able to use it as a way to redirect another spell to target something else, perhaps saving one of your creatures or one of your permanents, it is upside, and I do respect that, but as I mentioned, it's a bit outside of the scope of this episode in particular. Foil likely falls a step lower than our other counters so far, which is a bit odd considering it's both a hard and unconditional counterspell, but it really relies on being in a heavily blue deck where you can reasonably expect to have an island in hand to pitch. And it does require you to discard 2 cards, not just 1. Daze is probably the next free counterspell to consider, and it's a very soft counterspell, though an unconditional one. Paying the 1 isn't really a big ask at most points in most games of Commander. And while there may have been volumes written on how Daze can work as an offensive counterspell and a pseudo-ritual, the setup cost to make it work for this conditional of a counterspell means the card sees very little play in Commander. Disrupting Shoal is another odd duck in Commander. Even in CEDH, which has a relatively narrow band of mana value for the metagame's card pool, the card doesn't see play, as the card's free cast setup cost is really quite steep. And the setup cost is also an unknown until you need to know it. Certainly it's nice that it's a hard counter and can hit any type of spell, but even in CDH, where you can probably count on most spells being between 1 and 3 mana value, the fact that you have to pitch a specifically blue card with a mana value specifically equal to the spell that you're trying to counter is pretty rough. Finally, there's Thwart. What, you haven't heard of Thwart? Don't worry, I hadn't either. The setup cost for this unconditional hard counter is brutal. Return 3 islands to your hand. Even mono blue decks could have a hard time meeting this requirement, and it's virtually impossible to cast for free in 3+ color decks. And the 3 island requirement also means that the card cannot be cast for free until you have played or ramped into at least 3 islands. I think there's a good reason I hadn't heard of this one. Let's move on next to 1 mana value counterspells. Swansong is likely the best 1 mana value counterspell, giving a hard counter against instants, sorceries, and enchantments. Not being able to hit artifacts can be rough, and this is also our first example of a counterspell that provides compensation to an opponent, giving them a mostly irrelevant 2/2 flying bird. But only requiring a single blue mana and being a hard counter means Swansong is often going to see play before many free counterspells. After Swansong, there are some interesting choices. Flusterstorm is probably the most played counterspell after Swansong at the 1 mana value slot, as it offers a few unique edges for its low cost. While it is a soft counter, and a conditional one, it plays really well on offense, where we expect to cast a threat with a storm count of 1, then bait out a counterspell from an opponent, storm count 2, at which point we cast Flusterstorm, targeting the counterspell, creating 2 copies of Flusterstorm, for a total cost of 3 that our opponent needs to pay in order to resolve their spell. Like other soft counterspells, Flusterstorm only gets worse the later the game goes, but because it scales to the number of spells being cast, it can overcome that weakness better than a lot of other soft counterspells can. The fact that it is also not a single spell, but a spell in multiple copies is also sometimes relevant, particularly when an opponent only kept one mana open, expecting their own Swan Song to be adequate protection against counterspells. And if you're playing with Strixhaven Magecraft cards like Archmage Emeritus or Stormkiln Artist, the copies will draw you more cards or make you more treasure. The choices after this become very metagame dependent though. Miscast, Dispel, and Spell Pierce have their own strengths and weaknesses, and one may be a better fit for your deck than others. Miscast is probably the hardest soft counter at 1 mana value, taxing an opponent 3 additional mana to keep their spell on the stack, and it is very comparable to Flusterstorm. While it lacks some of the upsides that Flusterstorm does, it is more broadly applicable and tends to do slightly better on defense, where the storm count may only be 1 when you go to counter an opponent's instant or sorcery. And a 3-mana tax on a soft counterspell means that even if they can force their spell through, you've also often drained them of the additional mana they may have been counting on to multi-spell that turn. This makes Miscast pretty good early on, although it does lose power as the game goes on and players have access to more and more mana. If you're planning to go late game frequently, this could be a reason not to include Miscast. Spell Pierce is less conditional than any of the other spells we've discussed so far, being able to target any non-creature spell, but it's a soft counter with a tax of only 2 mana, which is significantly less than the 3 mana, and it falls off in power more quickly than cards like Flusterstorm and Miscast. So it's much more useful in decks that are hoping the game really doesn't go for too long. Dispel is the only hard counter that we've looked at thus far for 1 mana value, but it's also the most conditional, only able to target instants, making it just plain worse than Swansong. Its general use case in CDH is to stop other counterspells, while also occasionally being able to stop it ad nauseum. A new contender in this category would be an Offer You Can't Refuse, which is a hard counter conditional to a broad category of non-creature spells, and like Swansong, it has compensation for opponents, this time with 2 treasure tokens. Unlike the soft counters we've discussed so far, I would argue that an Offer You Can't Refuse gets better the longer the game goes, as the advantage of 2 additional treasures goes down relative to the amount of mana which players already have access to. But 2 mana, even as treasures, are probably going to be more relevant than a 2/2 flyer in most games. I would personally prefer to run Flusterstorm over an Offer You Can't Refuse, but I think it's a very valid discussion as to whether it is better or worse than the trio of Miscast, Spell Pierce, or Dispel, and I think it deserves some serious consideration here. I also think that Stubborn Denial is a serious contender, going from a very soft tax of 1 on the condition counter-target non-creature spell to a hard counter if you have a creature with a power 4 or greater. This was one of the big draws for CDH decks like Tasigur a few years ago, but it seems like CDH play these days really doesn't revolve around that quite so much. Outside of CDH though, if your commander has 4 or more power, I really like this as another strong 1 mana value counterspell. I'm not going to cover the various blue and X counterspells in this discussion, which are technically 1 mana value, as those are really soft counters which force you to often pay more than the person who is actually casting the spell, without really draining them of their ability to cast more spells later in the turn. Nor am I going to discuss some of the hyper-conditional spells which only counter sorceries, only counter a spell that targets a permanent you control, or only counter a spell that targets you. But I will mention that Abjure doesn't see much play because blue tends to have very few permanents on the field, particularly few that it can afford to sacrifice in order to fuel a counterspell. Wash Away is really just a cancel that you can occasionally cast for a single blue mana to counter the casting of a commander, which generally isn't a card you want to spend a counterspell on. I will give a quick nod to both Force Spike and Disrupt, the former of which is an unconditional but very soft counterspell, and the latter of which is a very conditional and very soft counterspell, which happens to cantrip. Of note, even a deck that's hungry for cantrips like Krark and Sakashima doesn't run Disrupt, which I think speaks to the weakness of the single mana tax on a soft counter. I do want to point out creature counters like Siren Storm Tamer, Mausoleum Wanderer, and Curse Catcher. The latter of these two actually see play in some modern archetypes of spirits and merfolk respectively, and very little play outside of those tribal decks. Where the relative softness of the counterspell they offer is made up for by allowing these creatures to synergize with the tribal effects of your deck. These creatures are on-board counterspells, and they lose a lot of the power of surprising your opponents with counterspells, where the counterspells which are lurking in your hand are unknown information. But I do think that Siren Stormtamer stands apart from these others slightly. The pirate subtype is shockingly relevant if Malcolm is your commander. While a very conditional counterspell, as it only stops spells that target you or a creature you control, it's also a hard counter, and it's a stifle effect, being able to counter abilities, which means that you can stop some of the channel lands from Kamigawa like Otawara or Iganjo, though it doesn't stop Boseiju outside of some very circumstantial scenarios, such as an opponent trying to Boseiju away an enchantment creature or artifact creature you control. Hey everybody, Future John here. As I kind of suspected, this episode got a little out of hand, so I'm gonna let Past John finish, but you'll have to wait till a little bit later for that episode to come up. Until then, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on YouTube, give us a like, give us a comment. You can also find us on Twitter where we are at GemstoneMineMTG, or you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is only the start of this episode.